I need to go through our code of conduct. So South by Southwest is committed to creating an enjoyable, memorable experience for all the attendees and the speakers. To help create this environment, we kindly ask all participants to act responsibly and treat each other with respect, empathy, and compassion. South by Southwest reserves the right to revoke South by Southwest entry credentials from any participant whose conduct is deemed by Southwest or security to be inappropriate, disorderly, or offensive. And the last part is personal items are prohibited from being left unattended for any reasons. Please do not save seats with personal items. Any item left unattended will be confiscated and destroyed by APD. Absolutely no exception. So, all right, awesome. So, like I said, my name is Brianna Wu. I'm a software engineer. I'm just going to introduce you. This is Shireen Mitchell. So, we're going to go down the table and introduce everybody. But Shireen, before we get started today, I kind of wanted to have kind of a conversation about getting to this point. There was a lot of media that was written about South by Southwest and the path getting here, in particular with, Gamergate getting a panel and then both panels being, canceled subsequently. But Shireen, there's kind of an untold story about getting to this point. So can you tell me a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So what hasn't been said in the media often is that it wasn't just those two panels. My panel was among the very first two panels, several panels actually, that was being, just a little bit. Oh, sorry. This session that you see right now is here as a result of the fact that it was actually eliminated in the beginning. I put this session in with Brianna Wu and Arthur Chu, and at that point, we were under attack by Gamergaters.
Yeah.
And that attack wasn't just what people think were just nasty comments.
Yeah.
I was constantly being hacked every day.
Yeah.
I was constantly being threatened. What you couldn't see in the background was what was happening to us.
Yeah.
And as that process continued, we finally got the panel picking session to end by ending all the comments. However, after that, I got an email basically saying my session was accepted, but that I need to change it. It needed to be changed to something closer to gaming. As you can see, what we're going to talk about today wasn't about gaming. It was about how women of color, in particular with the data I'm going to show, are affected online and in terms of online harassment and threats, and what that meant in general across the whole spectrum of the internet.
Right. And if I could say, you've been doing this since 1999,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
I've been doing this for 2 years. So I think you've got a little bit of seniority on me on this. So to have your voice erased and ask for you to participate in gaming programming, that's very much erasure. Wouldn't you agree?
It was complete, in my opinion. My perspective was not being respected. Absolutely. So when this happened, I felt. I formed Digital Sisters back in 1999, focused on getting women and girls of color into tech and STEM, way before it's cool. Everybody wants to talk about it now. It's like this hip thing about diversity. Well, I've been doing this for years, and I have been dealing with policy and dealing with tech industry about diversity. And so what was very interesting is that what I learned about the girls is that you can teach them the tech. That's not the problem. They will build the skills. What was happening is the cultural perspectives in the work environment and the harassment that they were having. Yeah. So I started focusing on how do we change that part of the culture so they want to be wanting to go into the tech industry.
Absolutely. So let's talk about, and we'll wrap this up. When we were trying to talk to South by Southwest to get your panel reinstated, which was pulled in lieu of a Gamergate panel, you had a lot of trouble communicating with South by Southwest. Yes. They were not returning your calls until basically I got involved with this, correct?
Well, until I think the media frenzy happened. So basically, I explained that my panel wasn't a gamer panel, but then I found out that the gaming segment was after interactive, and I said, at this point, after being harassed and under attack, you're putting me in an environment where I'm going to be harassed and attacked. Yeah. You're also putting me in an environment where there are no allies around me, so I'm unprotected. I'm also I'm in danger, but I'm also putting my panelists in danger. And even then, I was basically, I had submitted actually 2 panels. My second panel, which was also about women of color and as superheroes, was rejected immediately. And then I was basically told if I did not change it, that there was no promise that my panel could be present.
Yeah.
At that point, when the announcement went out, I saw the 2 panels. The one panel that we were promised was not going to be included,
Okay.
which was SafePoint, was included, and my panel was gone.
Okay. Well, I think today we're going to be talking a lot about the erasure of women of color viewpoints, but I just really want to be clear about that getting women of color represented on the panel today has been an uphill battle. And I respect South by Southwest. Casey has really worked hard for us in particular, but we're going to be talking about erasure of certain viewpoints, and our experience with South by Southwest was very much part of that. So on a happier note, Mary Ann, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great.
You're doing great. So we met this year at, we met at Harvard for a very specific conference. So can you tell people what you do and what kind of your work is about?
Yes, I'm a law professor at the University of Miami School of Law, and I teach First Amendment law, criminal law, family law, and one of my areas of focus is online harassment. And I'm the Legislative and Tech Policy Director and Vice President of an organization called the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative. And that's a nonprofit organization that is dedicated to combating online discrimination and abuse. And one of our first areas of focus is a phenomenon that is popularly referred to as revenge porn, which we refer to as non-consensual pornography, and that's the disclosure and distribution of people's sexually explicit material without their consent.
And this is a huge issue. Like we're going to be talking today a lot about erasure of viewpoints. And I know you have a lot to say about this, but it seems like every time this issue comes up, it's always framed in terms of basically protecting the people doing the harassing. Like the system is very much geared in favor of them. Do you agree with that? Is that a fair viewpoint?
I think that's true. I think one of the reasons why we have a problem like non-consensual pornography is because people obviously believe that they are entitled to attack. And this is really, I think it's clear that this is an attack, and it's predominantly directed at women. And like most forms of abuse that are directed at women, we tend to see a lot of indifference and even hostility to the victims of this particular conduct. And so you see law enforcement, you see legislators, you see civil liberties groups, you see the general public really condemning these women themselves, as opposed to looking at the problem and thinking about the impact and consequences, many of which include complete silencing, because women lose their jobs, they get kicked out of schools, they're forced to leave their homes, some of them have committed suicide. The impact of this happening to a particular person and the threat of it happening, the fear of it happening, really does deprive women as a group of the ability to feel that they can speak freely and act freely when they know that there's this possibility that if they exit a relationship or say something that somebody doesn't like or become a public figure in any way, that one of the first things that in the arsenal of harassers is, well, we'll find some naked pictures and distribute them, or if we can't find any, we'll Photoshop it that way.
Yeah, it's very destructive, and we're going to get to more of that impact today. So something I've noticed in my field is it's not just women developers are targeted, it's also journalists in our field are just as targeted. In particular, Gamergate has a very specific site set up that disproportionately goes after women journalists, and the accusations against them are quite baseless. So this is a pattern you're very familiar with, Elizabeth. Can you tell us a bit about what you do?
Absolutely. I run the International Women's Media Foundation, and we support women journalists around the world. We believe that the media is not truly free without the equal voice of women.
Oh, can you move the mic a little bit closer?
We believe that the media is not truly free without the equal voice of women, and online attacks against women journalists are directly targeting them to silence their opinions, and to silence their voice. We've seen this in a variety of ways that we'll talk about later, but female journalists are already disproportionately underrepresented in the news media, yet they are disproportionately attacked in the other direction in terms of online attacks. We know, because we've done research about attacks and harassment against women journalists, they face sexual harassment in the workplace, they face discrimination about the assignments that they cover, and they face the possibility of attacks when they're reporting the news, much like men journalists. We're not blind to the attacks that they face, but the online attacks are 3 times greater against women journalists, and this is really having an influence on the news media where women's voices are not being heard, and we are not hearing the voices, therefore, of women in our society, and that's a real danger.
It absolutely is. And, we're going to be talking about this more, but one of the things I think is really important is if you don't have people in that group, the coverage of it lacks perspective. And all too often, when we're talking about women in technology, more often than not, we're talking to male journalists. And there's just simply a perspective that they lack. Something that's very interesting to me is when I look at my coverage by women reporters and my coverage by male reporters, it's very, very different in color. So, one of my goals today is I don't want to make this a Gamergate panel. We've talked about it ad nauseum, but I do kind of want to give you all my perspective on this. In late 2014, I was targeted by Gamergate. What had basically happened is, before the Zoe Quinn incident, women in my field had been targeted and bullied and chased out of our industry for months. And it was like the water in the pot was boiling and the kitchen was about to catch on fire. For me, I had one very, very specific death threat that went hyper-viral after Will Wheaton tweeted it. And, I have found myself under horrendous abuse for the rest of the year. Just to give you some examples, I've had over 200 death threats. Some of them very, very serious, saying who, what, where, why, and when. This man in this mask right here sent me a picture on Reddit where he told me he was going to put a drill into my skull. It would be the last thing I ever felt. We gave his name to the FBI months ago, and nothing has happened with that. I had someone show up at my college a few weeks ago. My college's legal counsel called me and informed me that someone had showed up at my college impersonating me and had attempted to get my college records. They were partially successful at getting that at a different college I had attended and ended up releasing that onto a lot of different websites. One of them was Reddit, which would not even get back in touch with me. We're going to talk more about that later. So, the abuse that I've undergone this year has been extreme. My husband has been targeted. My dog has been, I had a dog that died last year, and as he was dying in my arms, Gamergate is going after my vet, trying to find his location and telling me they're going to kill me in the middle of that horrendous experience. So, we're not talking about people saying you suck on the internet. It's a lot more serious than that. So, Shireen, I want to kick it over to you because there's a lot of perspective here. So something very generally, when we talk about Gamergate, the 3 people you hear from the most are me, Zoe Quinn, and Anita Sarkeesian. And it's hard to not notice that when I've seen women of color targeted by Gamergate, that doesn't seem to get into the press as much. So I'd love to just kind of talk about this a little bit. And I was hoping we could start with this video you gave me right here. Oh, well, it's not going to play. So this is, I'm sure everybody's seen it. It's the video of Donald Trump rally and a woman of color being poked and prodded and basically screamed at
and pushed out the door.
Yeah.
And this, what people don't realize is that, honestly, like I said, I've been doing this a long time. The online harassment for women of color has been going on for a very long time. It's not new. It's new because we're having a bigger media conversation around it because it's gotten worse, in my opinion. There's the vitriol and the level of attacks on people has made news. However, in general, a woman showing up and a girl showing up into the tech industry is classified as, she does not belong there. So she gets poked and prodded and pushed out the door. And this video was an example of showing you how men were pushing and prodding a young girl out the door, screaming at her, and people were just taking photos. Police were there, and no one came to her rescue. And that's what it feels like being a woman online, particularly of color, because in general, the concept is that either we deserved it or we are not deserving of being protected. And that is a narrative that keeps getting removed in this conversation that needs to change.
So you have done you've collected some data
Yes.
among women of color, and this is, it's some frightening stuff we found. So we're just going to go straight through it.
Yeah.
You can walk me through this.
Yeah. So basically, I tried to get more women of color voices to attend this summit because I thought it was very important, and I gave a list of names of women who I thought could share their own stories. So I was not able to get them successfully here for various reasons, but what I did was poll them on their experiences so we have a better understanding of what's happening to women of color. And so when I polled them, I would tell you that the types of threats that they get go all the way down to, based on their political beliefs, their religious beliefs, and these are the candidates that have were surveyed the most happen to be Asian women, Pacific Islanders, African American women, and their top attacks are usually based on politics or based on religion. And then after that, that's when they get the sexual violence threats or the death threats. The other very important thing is that their children are the biggest target. That when someone wants a woman of color to be quiet, or silence her, the biggest target is her children. And one instance, and there's several instances, but there are instances where you'll see online and people don't even notice, someone will say, hope your child doesn't become a hashtag, is an example of be quiet.
Yeah. These are intersectional in nature, and it's almost, I hate to use the phrase double whammy,
Yes.
but it's like you're a woman and you're a black woman,
Yes.
and those threats go together
Yes.
and give you like a particularly nasty form of violence.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this series of threats that you see here, you see that a school, this is Yik Yak, is usually used on college campuses. If you look at the comments here, you'll see that they are both rape threats and race threats. That just being a person of color on campus could make you a target.
Yeah.
Now, the word in here says grape, and everybody knows that that's a way to avoid having your yak removed or stopped. So grape means rape. And so when this goes up anonymously and other women and women of color on campus see this, they are both getting the rape threats and the race threats. Yet when we have this conversation, the rape threats are separated from the race threats, when in truth, she's experiencing and worrying about both.
Yeah. So I want to get to Marianne in just a second, but I want to cover one more thing.
Yeah.
And this is about, this comes to the central problem where, if we're talking about Gamergate, very generally speaking, because it's a very specific set of lived experience, are the women that are being interviewed by press about this. So this is relevant because of the data you've collected about who is actually giving these threats. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, after I collected the data, there was three key. There were three top key issues. One was what the threats were based on, which is political, religious, and their children were targets. The second was that the biggest threats, the people who were threatening them were men. So about 90% were men. The other portion was white women, and then the third portion was men from their own ethnic background. So what I want to share with this that's really important is that when you silence women of color and you say that a white woman can come up and speak on behalf of a woman of color, or the man from her ethnic group can speak from, as a woman of color, there's a potential that you're putting their harasser on stage. That for me, for example, having the Save Point panel is basically putting my harassers on stage while I was being silenced and removed from the conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and I think it goes for a lot of marginalized communities.
Yes.
It goes for transgender, women particularly. It goes for people on the spectrum. Like, this is a problem across the board,
Yes,
and this is
definitely.
why it's so important to have different voices. So, Marianne, when I met you at Harvard this year, I, like many people, knew revenge porn was a problem, non-consensual sexual imagery. But it blows my mind just how big a problem this is, and the problems with it, and frankly, the lives that we're losing over this. So can you just kind of, you've got the floor, tell me all about this.
So I think it's important to understand the concept and the behavior behind non-consensual pornography as part and parcel of this broader question of online harassment.
Yeah.
What we're really focusing on here, what Shireen is also talking about, is the silencing impact. We're talking about the different ways in which people who are threatened by the messages given by women of color, by sexual minorities, the emphasis, I mean, what we're really seeing in this whole blow-up of online harassment is fear. Fear and rage on the part of people who have always had the floor, who have always had the capacity to express themselves, looking at other people who are now standing up and saying, we actually have some things to say and you're not going to like some of them. And there's nothing particularly new about this fear and this rage as a reaction. Back in 1838, when you had female suffragists who were planning the second anti-slavery convention in Pennsylvania Hall, 1838, these women were going to speak about abolition. They were going to talk about how we needed to get rid of slavery. They were going to talk about sexual equality. And what the men in this town did in the days leading up to the convention was put up signs to say, if you care about your jobs and the Constitution, you should protest against this convention. And on the day of the convention, they stormed the actual building and they set it on fire. And they actually grabbed the women and they tore off their clothes and they threw them down to the ground in many different protests dealing with abolition and dealing with female suffrage. So what we're looking at is quite literally silencing techniques, that we're so afraid of what these women might say that we have to do everything in our power to shut them up. And what we're seeing now is really the online equivalent of that. And non-consensual pornography is just one of those ways where we can shut women up. And it's certainly true, and I'm glad that Shireen keeps mentioning this, that there is definitely a difference in terms of how we speak about victims who happen to be women of color and everybody else. We all know about Jennifer Lawrence and the fact that her photos were hacked. We hear a lot less about Gabrielle Union. Same things happened to her, and yet that is not given as much focus, and we don't talk about the slightly different ways in which sexualization actually plays out, specifically for black women and differently from white women. So all of this combines for this really toxic kind of conduct where people use sex as punishment, where the way to destroy a woman is to bring up the fact that she's ever been naked, or to highlight the fact that she's ever trusted somebody enough to be intimate with them. And if you think about what that pathology really reveals, it's pretty disturbing, that we're going to take people at their most vulnerable, at their most trusting, at their most exposed, and use that as a way of saying, as a way of destroying that person's life, their career, their personal life, and in some cases resulting in suicide.
Yeah.
And what we have now is not just one-on-ones, typically revenge porn cases where the ex-boyfriend can't get over the fact that he's being left. It's also now an entire industry. And this industry is not focused on revenge at all. It's simply focused on making money. So you have websites that do nothing other than collect these types of images, solicit these images, and then provide them as entertainment for all of us. And so if you've never had the pleasure of looking at one of these sites, MyX.com is a pretty good example. You look at this page, you see that there's pictures of women. You can click on one of the links to actually submit the post, and if you want to see what that looks like, what these sites are asking for are not just the images. They don't just want the naked photos. Look at what else they want. They want their name, they want their age, they want their country, they want their state, their city, their Facebook, their Twitter. So it isn't just about saying, hey, look at some naked women without their consent. That in itself would be enough to raise concern, but it's also identify them across all their social media, find them and humiliate them. And that's just for fun, right? These are people who just do this for entertainment purposes. And there are about 3,000 websites that feature some form of non-consensual pornography. So what we're really seeing here is both a social impact and an individual impact. In individual cases, some women, as I say, lose their jobs, have to leave their homes. Their relationships will fall apart. They will stop being able to attend school. And in some cases, they will commit suicide because they can't deal with the fallout from this type of conduct.
I think it's really important to note, and if I can tell a very quick story here, just how much the system protects the people that are doing this. So, my email is like, I have so many women that write me constantly asking for help. So I got an email earlier this year from a woman that met a very disturbed man at an Oculus Rift event. So there's a person that is consulted for Oculus Rift, like they invite him on stage, they do a lot of work with him, and he doesn't vote for the same political party I do, and that's not a problem. But the problem is he has no problem with this whatsoever. And in fact, one of his employees is a notorious harasser of women, underage girls, like some really nasty stuff. He works for that person is happily employed by that person, and the entire system of having these people that have views that are so dangerous to women are just freely employed in our society, and there's no blowback at all for that. And I think it's a point we cannot stress enough, just how much the system protects this kind of behavior. So I wanted to move over to you, Alyssa, like in kind of framing these problems, like, you know, Shireen is talking about how we kind of don't hear about, you know, the perspective of women of color. You know, Marianne, you're talking about how this affects women, how it can destroy our lives, our careers. What is the impact of these kind of forces on women journalists?
I think it's really interesting these methodologies are all used offline as well to attack women journalists. Women around the world who are attacked and silenced by either corrupt government officials or businessmen who are trying to stop investigative reporting, all use these tactics against them because of their gender, against their children, against their families, and all of this has moved online, where women journalists are forced to conduct their business because that is where journalism is happening. The impact is great. Women are opting out of journalism at higher numbers than men. In the U.S., for example, the majority of people in journalism school are women, and yet they are not the majority of people in the news industry, certainly not the majority of people at the higher levels of the news industry. And this does have to do with this lack of safe space. Yeah. But this is a global problem, and we are these kinds of attacks are silencing women journalists around the world and are silencing the ability for us to get the news that really matters, and they're using these kinds of gender-based intimidation tactics, which constitute a real threat of freedom of the press.
Absolutely. So I want to get to two more things with everyone here. First, I want to really specifically talk about impact to very specific people. Marianne, you have a particularly heartbreaking story. You know, in my studio, Giant Space Cat, we have an employee. We have a Patreon, and my Patreon funders are nice enough to give us the resources that we have a woman in our company that all she does all day is she catalogs threats to me. She tries to get them, she tries to affect policy. And, you know, actually we're going to have a piece in a very major website in a few weeks, like talking statistically. These are not feelings, these are facts about what the outcome is on these, with different social media companies. I want to very quickly go through a bit of an overview on this, because I think there's a way we talk about social media, and I don't think it's particularly accurate. So I want to talk about outcomes with social media, with what happens when you actually report harassment. So the thing I feel like people don't know and appreciate is Twitter has a lot of problems. Twitter has a lot of problems, which is why we talk about it so much. I wish the press would appreciate just how hard Twitter is working on these problems, because we see it when we talk to them and work with them. They have updated their hiring pipeline. Let me give you an example. Before all of this happened, Twitter did not really understand what the dynamics were for transgender women and transgender men, with dead naming, for instance. You know, I know for a fact Twitter has worked behind the scenes and updated those policies. At my own studio, these are just my approximate guesses. We're getting the tally out right now, but at the beginning of Gamergate, their odds of successfully suspending an account that was harassing us was around 5%. Today, I would estimate that that is, would be higher to 20 to 30%, which is a really big improvement. So they are getting better. What we don't talk about enough is Reddit. I can't say this clearly enough. Reddit is failing women in every marginalized community spectacularly. I told you all how the other day my college records were released. You know, I'm trying to back channel with Reddit to talk about something that very clearly should not be on the internet, and they just don't even want to hear it. So I would love to see us move away from talking about Twitter so much, even though it's very important, but to look at, you know, a site like Reddit. Like, they might not be able to post the actual pictures anymore, Marianne, of this, but like, you know, they can link to stuff that's damaging a woman's reputation. Yes. And we see it absolutely every day.
But I just will say that it's not just it's not just the tech companies themselves.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what gets created. What we need to remember is that for me, when it was BBS boards, this was the same behavior. What we haven't done is try to deal with the behavior itself. We think that there's some way that the tech company will have a new tool that will change some of this, but it doesn't even matter which platform it is. It's ultimately, these are the kinds of things that happen to women when they engage online or even just put themselves forward in any way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that brings us over to, there's a really big discrepancy I've found in my studio. And again, I'm an engineer. I'm talking about math, science, and statistics here. So in our studio, we found out that YouTube rather, has a reputation for some pretty crappy comments on there. So we looked at they finally updated their reporting tools. So you can actually report things like hate speech against transgender people, black people, a lot of marginalized groups. So we did an experiment in my studio. So I had random people submit, I think it was 20 different comments in videos about lynching black people, to see what YouTube would actually do. In response to this, they only responded to 2 out of 20. If I showed you pictures of this, it is some of the most horrific comments imaginable. So there's this very, very wide discrepancy between what the tech companies say they do and what the outcome actually is. So, Shireen, I want to turn this over to you now. Like, what do you see in terms of very specific impact to your, women of color?
So I would say that on the scale that for them, economic impact or economic insecurity is number one. That, once your name is in the news, once your name is a part of something bad, there's an automatic sense that you are trouble, and though you're the victim, but that you are trouble and can't be hired. So I would say on average, they either don't take jobs. I think the journalists may not take certain jobs because of this, but I also think for women, especially in the industry, they will not take certain jobs because, one, they will not take certain jobs, but two, they will not be offered jobs. We already have challenges, we know that, in terms of hiring, and so what for them, number one, is definitely economic insecurity, and that's a big problem because they have to take care of their families as well. The second is, is that there's this constant lack of physical safety. And that physical safety is combined by the fact that if you haven't been watching the news already, if you saw one of the instances where a young man was at one of the rallies and he was just walking up the stairs and got punched, the police jumped on him. So that lack of safety includes the fact that if I was to say I'm being harassed, even if something actually happened to me, and there was a crowd, there would be more of a likelihood that I would be pulled down and arrested versus the person that harassed me. Yeah. So that is clear that's like this ongoing fear for not just for themselves physically, but also their children in those instances.
Absolutely.
And the other is especially for their children, but the other is just the ongoing stress of this imbalance. You don't feel safe. You don't know who's there, who can protect you. If you don't have allies and and family around to protect you, ultimately what do you do? And there, in the industry the industries as well, whether it's policies, whether it's politics and legislation, are not doing enough to make sure that we are also a part of the spectrum of needing protection. The data that I showed that for taking this seriously for women of color, over about 90% said no, that police or law enforcement don't take it seriously. Politicians and legislators do not take it seriously for them, and tech companies and social media companies do not take it seriously. So overwhelmingly, like 90%, they feel that's how unsafe they feel.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I think it's so telling that this last week, Google hired Chris Poole, the founder of 4chan, to come work for their social media. And, I had a lot of friends of mine that were, cisgender white dudes in tech, some of them, very famous figures that were advocating like, oh, he shouldn't not be able to make a living. And I was thinking of some of the women of color I know this year that have been really brutally targeted for no reason whatsoever who face that economic insecurity.
Yes.
I was really thinking about those double standards.
And also why some of them didn't come to this conference because of that safety.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So, Marianne, I want to get to, this is a story I think about every day, honestly, because sometimes when like pictures of Jennifer Lawrence get on the internet, I see it consumed as like entertainment, right?
Yeah.
So this is a story about a very specific woman, and this really broke my heart. So can you talk about that?
So unfortunately, if you wanted to pick terrible stories about non-consensual pornography, you'd have no shortage of things to pick from. But one of the worst, I think, most tragic stories was the story of Rehtaeh Parsons, who was a Canadian teenager, and when she was 15 years old, she went to a party. And at that party, surrounded by what she thought were friends, she had something to drink. And at that party, she was sexually assaulted by 4 of the boys at this party. And at least one of these boys, instead of helping as he was watching her being sexually assaulted, decided that he would take pictures of what was happening. And at least one of these boys, or maybe more of them, then decided also to distribute these images as entertainment among the wider school audience. And Rehtaeh Parsons became extremely depressed, not only in light of the attack, of course, but the fact that these pictures were circulating everywhere she went. Everybody had seen them. Her entire family had seen them. Everyone at her school had seen them. She was being constantly harassed and taunted, called a slut, called a whore. This is, after all, we're talking about a rape victim who's being called a slut and a whore on a daily basis. And eventually, a couple years later, she hanged herself. Her father wrote a very heartbroken and very important letter called Rehtaeh Parsons Was My Daughter. And in that letter, which I really recommend that everyone read, he asked, why is it that they didn't just think they would get away with it? They knew that they would get away with it. They took photos of it, they posted it on their Facebook walls, they shared it with the world as if it were a funny animation. And I think that is really it's so damning and it's so important, right? Because it's not just about what these boys did. It's the fact that we've created a culture in which these boys thought that they could do this and should do this and that they would never receive any punishment for it. Yeah. We have created that culture. What he's asking, what her father is asking, is how did we let this happen? How did we become a culture where we could rely on the fact that boys can do this and they can assume that law enforcement won't do anything, that the school won't do anything, that no one who has power will stand up for people like Rehtaeh Parsons and do anything? They were sure of it, and they were right.
Yeah. So I want to get to actual specific policy things that we want, but Alyssa, very quickly, do you have a similar story of a very specific impact that has hurt a specific journalist that you can share with us today?
Yeah, absolutely. Some of you may have heard a case of a woman called Khadija Ismailova from Azerbaijan. Her case garnered some international attention. She writes against corruption at the highest levels of the Azerbaijani government and became a target of the government with lawsuits and other things. But one of the things that they did is they put cameras in her home and photographed her, filmed her in intimate situation with her boyfriend. And Azerbaijan is a Muslim country, so this has other implications as well. Then they sent her the videos and told her that if she didn't stop her reporting, they were going to post them. And I've had the pleasure of meeting her, so it did not surprise me when I heard that she said, fine, go ahead. I'm not going to stop. And they did post them. She came to the International Women's Media Foundation. We got her some legal help and got the images removed from a server in Texas, and then they were moved to Central America, where it's nearly impossible to get them removed. I think it was Costa Rica or Panama. And now she's in prison. And so the point is that these governments and these actors are going to try various ways to silence journalists. And if one way doesn't work, they're going to try another. And one of the ways that is increasingly being used to silence journalists is online harassment and attacks. There are concerted attacks where people are being bombarded with messages, and it basically makes it impossible for them to do their jobs. Yeah. They're being outed in various places where they're reporting in southern Turkey, in very dangerous places where people are saying, this journalist is here now, you should find her. And so the online world for journalists has become a very dangerous place.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want each of us to go through and very quickly say what we specifically want from a policy point of view. And I'll be happy to talk to press about this after in more detail. But let's kind of keep the highlights because I want to get to a few questions. For me, what we specifically need, like we told you horror stories today, but most of what I need could be addressed. And we are at a point where declarations of noble intentions from these social media companies is not cutting it anymore. So there are a few very specific policies that I want to see. I have so many transgender friends that have been targeted over the course of Gamergate. Now, I've seen Twitter step up their specific policies on this, but with Facebook, I can't say this clearly enough to you. Facebook is a very, very, very dangerous place for transgender women. It's almost as dangerous as Reddit. Now, as best as we have been able to ascertain at our studio by doing, by submitting things, finding out what the outcome is, Facebook does not protect transgender women at all. If you're a transgender person and you report harassment, Facebook is going to send you a message back that says, hey, free speech, sorry. And their terms of service don't even seem to protect transgender people. The most egregious thing at all, I could not believe this when I saw this, is if at Facebook, if you report something very specifically and they choose not to do anything about this, your only appeal to them, they give you this form like, do you need to talk to someone else about it? And you can follow out that form, but you don't email Facebook. They ask you to email your friends to ask them for help about this. So I want to see Facebook step up and address this policy. Another thing that we very specifically need, and I cannot emphasize this enough, is if we don't have independent oversight to measure this stuff from the outside, it is never going to get better. So, I have a friend at the Women's Action Media Center, and they have worked with social media companies to kind of measure what these outcomes are. We need these companies to agree to outside auditing of their practices so we can get objective data about how they're getting it done. So, Shireen, for you, what are the very specific policy issues you would like to see covered?
So a couple of things. First, I just want to say that, diversity is not a trend, and I really hate that we are having this conversation at a time when people think that that's what this is really about. Diversity is my life because I have to live it every day, and it's every person who happens to come from a different perspective. And so we really do, the numbers are bad. Tech companies, 90% men, and basically white men. We need more diversity at these companies so that when something alarming is coming up through the pipeline, that we are actually, that I would say women of color are canaries in the coal mine, that ultimately that when there's an alarm coming from a woman of color, there's something really going on that needs to be addressed, and it's just not a simple thing. So we need more people who can be in the pipeline and more policies. I've seen plenty of tech policies that focus on gender parity all over the place, but they will not put policies in place that is inclusive of race and gender together. The other is I've collected this data, we're going to continue to collect this data, but we have to really do a better job of collecting the data and looking at the cross-section. Because I promise you, if you look at that data where roughly 10% of, I think it's roughly 10% Hispanic, Black, and multiracial are working at tech companies, you don't see the cross-sections to know where women of color are there. So we need to collect data that allows us to see what's really happening and not just adoption rates. We need to see what's happening to them online and collect that data and change policies.
Absolutely.
And then we need legislators to really look at ways to be more inclusive, that they are when we talk about swatting, we need to look at issues that will be disproportionately different for a family of color if someone calls the cops and say active shooter for their household. It is a very different thing. So we really need to look at those details and look at these policies and come up with something comprehensive. And these councils that they have, they need to be more diverse. They need to have women of color working with them on these councils to look at sexual harassment. And that needs to be a global perspective, but they need women of color to be a part of that. I see a lot of, there's women, there's men of color, but there's no intersection where you see women of color at the table helping to make some of these decisions.
I think that's very well said. Marion, I know you have you were talking about legislation, so I know you have some very specific legislative goals, and I also know you face some roadblocks specifically from the ACLU. So can you talk about that? What do you want, and what are the obstacles in getting there?
I think we have to think about this. I mean, what we try to do at the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative is to think about this as a comprehensive plan of attack, right? Everything has to change. It's not, is it tech, or is it law, or is it social norms? It's obviously all of those things. So what we want and what we've been trying to demand is legislative reform and technological reform and social norm reform. We want all of those things because all of them have to come together. And so specifically what we have done, I've created a model statute for the criminalization of non-consensual pornography. We used to only have about 3 states that had any type of law that would apply to non-consensual pornography. In the last couple of years, we've now reached a number of 27, which is progress. They're not all good laws, but at least there's progress on the front of passing some of them. And we've had a federal legislative draft of a bill that would actually criminalize this at a federal level waiting for some time. And I want to notice here that there are really wonderful, there's wonderful work being done by certain members of Congress, including Representative Jackie Speer, who is sponsoring this legislation for non-consensual pornography, and Catherine Clark on online harassment and other forms. So what's happening, though, what we're facing some of our greatest challenges is that part of this narrative about harassment or abuse being free speech is not just coming from the mobs. It's not just coming from the harassers and the X's. It's also coming from groups like the American Civil Liberties Union and sometimes the EFF, who do incredible work in other ways, but very often these types of issues are cast even by these organizations as freedom of speech issues. And so what's happening is that your everyday harasser, your revenge porn site owner, they get cover from this type of narrative. They get cover to say, yeah, see what we're saying? Harassing women isn't really anything bad. It's just freedom of speech that you don't happen to like. And that's a narrative that we absolutely have to change on every level. We can't allow anyone, whether that's the ACLU or these online mobs, to say, we get to define what free speech is, and when women complain about abuse or harassment, we'll just call that something else. It actually has to mean, if we care about civil rights and civil liberties, that everybody gets access to those rights. And if women say this is harassment, this is not free speech, this is my privacy that should be protected like anybody else's privacy, they need to be able to say that. Yeah. Now, as Brianna was saying at the very beginning, we're not talking about insults, we're not talking about saying mean things to each other online. We're talking about things that actually risk people's physical safety, their psychological health, and their educational and work opportunities. These are serious issues. That's what civil rights was supposed to be about. We were supposed to recognize the fact that only certain people were getting access to freedom of speech. Only certain people were allowed to walk into restaurants. Only certain people were allowed to get certain types of jobs. And at some point, there was at least an articulation in the part of some people that that was wrong. And forcing out people of color and forcing out women was not okay. And it was not actually something that was permissible according to the Constitution. So what we need to remember now is the same thing is happening now. People are getting pushed out. People are getting silenced. People are having their entire lives and reputations destroyed. And if we care about freedom of speech and if we care about privacy, we have to care about that too.
I think that's well said. And I hope I see media cover the very specific statute, the model statute that you want to get passed. I think it's a very good balance between privacy and allowing open speech. So, Alyssa, for you, what is the specific thing that you were looking for, very quickly?
Well, I think the media organizations themselves can do a lot in this regard, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe is actually doing a lot of work on research about online harassment for women journalists, and they recommend a couple of things. One is for media organizations to have guidelines to identify this kind of harassment that's happening to their staff and freelancers, and to monitor their abuse, to provide support for those who are being targeted with this kind of abuse, psychosocial support and other forms of assistance. Also to create a company culture where there is no tolerance for this kind of harassment and abuse, and where there is gender parity. That is really important as well. And to have procedures for content monitoring as well.
I've always felt, to a certain extent, it doesn't matter what any of the three of us do on our side if we don't have women journalists covering this. And it's such a, we are in symbiosis here, right? It's about all of our voices. So do we have time for about 10 minutes of questions? Is that okay? All right, I'm going to say yes. So line on up and we will answer your questions as best as we can. Come on, somebody be bold. Yeah. Can you turn up the mic?
It's being live streamed.
Okay. Hi, my name is Yasmin Green from Jigsaw, which is part of Google Alphabet. Thank you guys so much for sharing your stories, and you inspire my group a lot at Google to do our work. I wondered if you could talk about the degree to which the abuse that you've experienced and studied is organized. So whether it be for commercial purposes or just, there seems to be an agenda and a magnitude to what you're describing, and I'm wondering if you think that there's a machinery behind it too.
There absolutely is. A journalist I very much respect is Samantha Allen, and she talked about how very interesting thing about 2016 is women and feminists and people, women of color, all of us are talking a lot more and connected to each other about our equality. But like, Marianne, you're talking about very specific sites that exist to harass us. Kotaku in Action should be removed from Reddit today. There's no reason for that to be there. It brings nothing to a conversation but harassment. And the truth is, 8chan, I have no idea why that server hasn't been shut down. They dox federal judges, they put people's credit card information out there. I have actual proof that there are SQL injection tools on there, other very illegal hacking tools, DOS attack tools there. Like, it's just simply the most outrageously illegal stuff you can imagine. Child pornography too. So there absolutely are. Do any of you have anything to add to that about very specific places where people congregate?
I don't think it's a specific location. I think that when people, it's very interesting to see perspectives where someone throws a person's name in a hashtag or decides that this person just needs to be shut down. They just sort of tell, they sort of broadcast it, and then people just start to congregate to go after them. Yeah. And the other unfortunate thing is that they do set, which we always have to work to do, set up what they call dox lists, where they put people's names up there as targets. Yeah. So whenever anything happens, they just go back to the list to go after those people. Yeah. That's kind of what happened to us in the beginning. Yeah, it is. So it's that kind of thing that needs to, and when those lists go up, we need to be able to get them removed very quickly, because once the information is captured, you basically have ways in which to attack someone, and people keep that information themselves. We don't know where that information is now being stored, and then they go back to the list over and over again.
I think that's well said. Next question.
Hi, Brianna. One of the things that you mentioned was that like 2 years ago, Twitter had like a 5% success rate with suspending accounts that were
Sure.
harassing, and that now present 20% success, generally speaking.
Mm-hmm.
Looking back, what do you think caused it to be like 2 years of time to improve that? Is it that the company needed to internally discuss policy? Was it an engineering challenge?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have a very specific answer for that. I want to be very, very clear here that my studio, we have so many death threats and harassment threats that we collate and put together. 5% is my current estimate, having lived that. So you're going to see the actual numbers come out in a few weeks, so that might be different. I want to be very clear about that. I want to tell you a story about WWDC 2014, the year that Gamergate came out. And I flew to San Francisco. I was, Apple flew me in to attend WWDC, or rather, they gave me a ticket. And I was watching the keynote at Twitter headquarters because I couldn't get into the main stage. So I was there with a bunch of the Twitter engineering team. And I want to tell you, I have a lot of friends on that team that I respect, but I didn't meet one woman that day. I didn't meet one woman of color, and it was such a homogenous group. And unfortunately, there's a sexual discrimination lawsuit against Twitter right now. I had a friend of mine that worked at Twitter that told me about an internal study they did at that company where women had a virtually 0% chance, self-reported, of feeling like they would rise to a management position at Twitter. This was in 2014. So, the truth is, I want to be really clear. There's nothing wrong with being a white, cisgendered white dude. That's fine. But there is a very specific lived experience that you bring to the table. So when you don't have women represented in setting those policies, when you don't have women represented in building those frameworks and APIs, when you don't have women of color talking about, okay, you're looking at your definitions of what constitutes harassment, let's talk a little more specifically about what that means for us. It's that problem. Please.
Yeah, I would piggyback on that and just sort of say that there's a lot of framing of diversity being sort of the thing that is sort of the reason that these attacks are happening. And what I want to push back on a little bit is that, you know, everyone should be okay with their lived experience. And that when we come to the table with that experience, that means that I'm going to look at technology from my experience, from my culture, from the things that have happened to me, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's just different. And so once we can get to the place of understanding that and sort of figuring out how to bridge that, I always say to people, there's no tech fix for human behavior, because it's not. There's no way to fix what goes on wrong in our society. What we need to do is build the tech based on our society and then figure out how to deal with the aspects of it. Right now, we build tech and we try to nudge society to make it fit in. And as you can tell, we're failing.
Yeah. I think it's a multifactorial solution. I think it's on the law side, on the jurisprudence side. I think it's on the technical side. But I think we've got to change this culture where when women or people of color or LGBT people share their experience and ask for changes, that we stop getting this extremely defensive, angry behavior from cisgender white men. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, but we get shouted down on a daily basis.
And I think it's usually because they think they're the one person doing it and they're only doing it the one time. They don't realize that everybody thinks that.
Yeah.
So that poking and prodding video I was trying to show you was that that's what it feels like. You're basically in this environment and people are poking and prodding at you, and you're supposed to not say anything and just take the poking and prodding.
All right.
There's one more question. I thought we only have
Yeah.
a minute left.
Thank you. My name is Johanna Nylander. I work for the Swedish Games Industry Association, and my question is, what advice do you have for younger women who are thinking about pursuing a career in games or tech and have heard about Gamergate or online harassments? And yeah, I know you have a lot of experience, so your best advice.
Find girlfriends in the industry. It's I often think of it like a heal spell, that when you have a really horrendous day, you get to talk to women in the industry to support you, and it makes you last a little bit longer. Marian, you haven't really, or Alyssa, do you have any thoughts on this?
I was going to say something that I think ties together all these questions, and that is to say that there's both, I mean, speaking directly in terms of advice, but also in terms of diagnosing the problem, which I think is helpful as a first step, that there is, on the one hand, the concerted pathological harasser behavior types. Those people exist, that's true. But there's also, I think has already been mentioned, there's also a lack of awareness or a lack of concern from the people who are writing all of our code, right? And I mean that in terms of our legal codes, our software codes, our social codes. There's just a sense in which it's being centered around the same people that have always had power, and that has to stop. That if we want to have change, there's going to have to be a change in the code, right? This is something that Larry Lessig has talked about before. You won't get equality and justice by accident, and you won't get it from the people who are more than happy just to simply take what they've been given and to keep it and to stop anybody else from getting it. So what I think has to happen is everybody has to make these demands. All the people that want a place in the code have to say, all of you are responsible. The fact that it's possible in this day and age to simply not do anything, and you could be as much part of the problem as the people who are avidly out there doing something, all of that has to change. Everybody has a responsibility for the society that we have. So I would say to younger women especially, make sure that your voice is being heard, because if the code is going to change, it's going to be because of people like you. And I think to echo what Brianna is saying, know that some of us have your back and that there is such a thing as solidarity.
I have to tell you, that's the best thing in game dev. There's a very large group of women that will have your back, and we've freaking had enough at this point. So, do you have anything to add?
No, I just echo that. I think it sounds very simplistic, but the support mechanisms are really powerful, and they're being used, to address these kinds of attacks and address many other kinds of attacks as well. And there is a significant amount of research that shows that the way that somebody responds to these attacks, if they are being supported and if they report them and talk to people who support them and who don't belittle them and tell them to brush it off, is quite different. So to find that support is hugely important if you think you're going to find yourself in an environment where you're going to need it.
Absolutely. Thank you all for coming today. We appreciate it. Thank you to all my panelists. This was fantastic.